Hey there! Tonight the journey takes us behind the gilded doors of European royal courts, into the intricate world where power, ceremony and daily life intertwined in ways that most people today barely understand, where every gesture carried meaning, where the simple act of waking a king required elaborate ritual, where hundreds of people worked in carefully organised hierarchies to maintain the spectacle of monarchy. The popular imagination often reduces royal courts to ballrooms and crowns, to dramatic moments of intrigue and romance, but the reality was far more complex, far more structured, far more fascinating than simplified versions suggest. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this exploration of how power actually operated in the age of kings speaks to something inside that curious mind of yours, and let the comments know where in the world this video is finding its way to tonight. It's always fascinating to see how many different places share this interest in understanding the machinery of monarchy, the elaborate systems that kept royal households functioning across centuries of European history. Now find that comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into a story about how royal courts actually worked. Not the romanticised version of historical dramas, but the real, complex, sometimes absurd reality of institutions that combined government and household, public spectacle and private life, genuine power and elaborate theatre, in ways that reveal profound truths about authority, society, and the human need for structure and ceremony. When modern people think about royal courts, the mental image often comes from films and television shows, grand ballrooms filled with elegantly dressed nobles swirling across polished floors to the strains of orchestral music, dramatic political intrigues conducted in shadowy corridors where whispered conspiracies determine the fate of nations, romantic encounters in torchlit palace gardens where forbidden love blooms despite social barriers, perhaps a scene of the monarch holding audience while courtiers bow and scrape in exaggerated deference, their faces masks of obsequious respect, concealing whatever calculations or resentments might actually occupy their thoughts. These images are not entirely wrong. Courts did feature formal balls and political manoeuvring and elaborate deference rituals, did include romance and intrigue and spectacular displays of wealth and power, but they capture only tiny fragments of what courts actually were, missing the vast infrastructure that made such moments possible, the hundreds of people whose daily labour sustained the institution, the complex rules and hierarchies that governed every interaction, from the most public ceremonies to the most mundane daily tasks. The way that courts functioned simultaneously as households where people lived and worked, as governments where the business of ruling was conducted, as entertainment centres where culture was created and consumed, and as living symbols of royal power that existed as much to impress and intimidate as to accomplish any practical purpose, each aspect requiring its own staff, its own protocols, its own daily routines that had to be coordinated into a functioning whole that operated smoothly enough to maintain the appearance of effortless magnificence that was itself one of the court's primary products, since appearing magnificent was as important as actually being magnificent, since the performance of power was inseparable from the reality of power in systems where so much depended on perception and reputation, and the maintenance of mystique that elevated monarchs above ordinary humanity. A royal court was not just a location, but an entire world unto itself, a micro-society with its own rules and customs and hierarchies, its own economy and social structure and cultural patterns, a place where political power was exercised, but also where meals had to be cooked, and clothes had to be cleaned and horses had to be fed, and countless mundane details had to be managed every single day to keep the whole elaborate mechanism running smoothly, where the visible spectacle that impressed visitors and intimidated rivals rested on an invisible foundation of logistics and labour that few people outside the court ever saw or understood, where behind every grand ceremony and elaborate ball were days or weeks of preparation by servants and craftspeople, whose names nobody recorded but whose work made everything possible, where the distance between the glamorous surface and the unglamorous reality was vast but carefully hidden, since part of what made courts effective was the ability to present complexity as effortless, to make elaborate preparation appear as spontaneous magnificence, to hide all the sweaty labour and careful planning that went into creating moments of apparent perfection, the concealment being as important as the accomplishment, since admitting to effort would diminish the aura of natural superiority that courts worked so hard to project, would reveal monarchs as dependent on large staffs of ordinary people, rather than as semi-divine beings whose power flowed naturally from their exalted status, would puncture the careful mystique that was essential to maintaining the authority and legitimacy that effective rule required in systems based fundamentally on personal loyalty and direct relationships, rather than on impersonal, bureaucratic structures or democratic legitimacy, where the monarch's person was the centre and foundation of the entire political system, where everything radiated outward from that centre, where proximity to the royal presence was the currency that mattered most, where access and favour were the ultimate goals that ambitious courtiers pursued through whatever means presented themselves. The physical space of a royal court varied enormously depending on time period, location, and the wealth and power of the particular monarch, ranging from relatively modest establishments in smaller kingdoms or during periods of royal weakness to absolutely massive complexes like Versailles, or the Hofburg or the Escorial that housed thousands of people and covered acres of ground. But certain features were common across most European courts during their peak periods in the Renaissance and early modern era, when royal power was at its height, and when courts reached their maximum elaboration and complexity. The palace itself was usually an enormous structure or complex of structures, containing not just the royal family's private apartments, where they slept and maintained whatever minimal privacy their exalted positions allowed, and the grand ceremonial spaces that hosted public functions like throne rooms and ballrooms and chapels where the theatre of monarchy was performed, but also offices for government officials and ministers who conducted the actual administration of the kingdom, workrooms for various crafts and services from bakeries to blacksmith forges to workshops where luxury goods were created, living quarters for courtiers who were expected to reside at court, and for servants who staffed the endless operations, storage facilities for everything from wine cellars to armouries, to warehouses full of linens and dishes, and all the supplies that a court consumed in astonishing quantities, kitchens capable of producing meals for hundreds of people simultaneously using cooking technologies that would seem impossibly primitive to modern observers, but that represented sophisticated operations by the standards of their time, stables for the many horses that were essential to pre-industrial transportation, and that required constant care and significant space and staff, chapels and religious facilities since religion was deeply intertwined with monarchy, and since demonstrating piety was politically important for monarchs who claimed to rule by divine right, libraries and art collections that demonstrated culture and learning, treasuries where the physical wealth of the kingdom was stored, guardrooms and barracks for the soldiers who provided security, and countless other specialised spaces that a functioning court required, all organised into a layout that reflected both practical necessity and symbolic meaning, with the most important spaces located closest to the royal apartments, arranged so that one moved through increasingly exclusive and private areas as one approached the physical centre where the monarch resided, with increasing distance from the royal person correlating roughly with decreasing status, so that physical location within the palace communicated social position in ways that everyone understood intuitively, making the palace itself a map of the social hierarchy, a physical embodiment of the structures that governed court life, where knowing the geography meant understanding power relationships, where the ability to move freely through restricted spaces demonstrated privilege that others envied and sought, access to the king's presence being the ultimate privilege that everyone sought, the most valuable commodity in a system organised entirely around that central person, the ability to enter the most private royal spaces being limited to a tiny handful of the most favoured and most trusted courtiers, while others had to remain in outer rooms, their distance from the centre of power made visible in architecture and geography, their exclusion marked by doors they could not pass through, and guards who barred their way, and spaces they could glimpse but never enter. A spatial hierarchy that everyone understood, and that shaped daily life in countless subtle ways, determining not just where people could go, but how they perceived themselves and others, how they understood their place in the elaborate social structure that the palace architecture both reflected and reinforced. The palace at Versailles, constructed and expanded by Louis XIV during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, illustrates the scale and complexity that major courts could achieve when monarchs had sufficient resources and ambition to create showpiece establishments that would impress the world and demonstrate beyond any doubt the power and magnificence of their kingdoms, a structure that housed not just King Louis XIV and his family, but thousands of courtiers, servants, officials and visitors, a small city in itself with its own economy and social system, its own rules and rhythms that differed from the world beyond the palace gates, a place that consumed vast resources and employed enormous numbers of people in an operation whose scale would be difficult to comprehend without visiting the physical site and seeing the sheer size of the buildings and gardens that Louis created. Louis XIV deliberately expanded Versailles from a relatively modest hunting lodge into the largest palace complex in Europe, and then required his nobility to spend significant time there, using architecture and the obligations of court attendants as political tools, keeping potential rivals close where he could watch them and where they could watch each other, making them dependent on royal favour for their positions at court, for the apartments they occupied within the palace, for the pensions and privileges and appointments that provided income, since many nobles spent more than they earned and relied on royal generosity to maintain their expensive lifestyles, transforming the dangerous independent nobles who had caused civil wars earlier in the century during Louis's minority into relatively tame courtiers whose ambitions were channeled into competition for status within the court system, rather than armed rebellion against royal authority, whose energies were consumed by the elaborate social manoeuvring that court life demanded, rather than by building independent military forces or political networks in their provincial territories. A brilliant political strategy that used ceremony and etiquette as instruments of governance, that turned the traditional relationship between king and nobles into something more controlled, more favourable to royal power, more stable and predictable. The elaborate daily rituals and the requirement to maintain suitable appearance and entourage at court, draining noble finances and occupying noble time that might otherwise have been spent building independent power bases in the provinces, forcing nobles to spend money on clothes and carriages and servants to maintain proper dignity at court where everyone was watching, and where falling behind in the competition for display meant loss of status that could have practical consequences, the court becoming a kind of elegant trap that neutralised political opposition by transforming it into competition for favour and precedence within a system that the king controlled completely, where he set the rules and judged the competitions and distributed the rewards, where success or failure depended ultimately on royal will, where even the most powerful nobles were reduced to supplicants who had to please the king to maintain their positions and privileges, where independent power was gradually eroded and replaced by dependence on royal favour, the transformation being accomplished not through violence or legal changes, but through social pressure and economic incentives, and the gradual creation of a culture where being absent from court meant being irrelevant, where everything important happened in the king's presence, where only those at Versailles mattered politically and socially, making exclusion from court effectively equivalent to political death, ensuring that nobles would comply with royal expectations and compete for favour rather than challenging royal authority, Louis XIV's genius being less his administrative reforms or military victories than his creation of this system that made rebellion seem impossible and unthinkable, that channeled noble ambition into safe directions, that turned potential enemies into dependents, that made absolute monarchy function smoothly by building social and cultural structures that supported it, that transformed raw power into legitimacy through the daily performance of ceremonies that naturalised royal supremacy and made it seem inevitable and proper. The Sun King's reign representing perhaps the peak of European absolutism, not just in theory but in practice, not just in legal terms but in lived reality. The court at Versailles being the machine that made absolutism work, the social technology that transformed political theory into functioning government, the daily embodiment of principles that might otherwise have remained. Abstract, making Louis XIV's power real and visible and tangible in ways that inspired imitation across Europe, other monarchs attempting to create their own versions of Versailles, their own elaborate court systems that would enhance royal authority and control nobility, and demonstrate magnificence that would impress foreign powers and domestic subjects alike, though few achieved the same level of success, or created establishments as large and influential as Versailles became. Louis's court-setting standards that others aspired to meet but rarely matched, remaining throughout the 18th century the model that defined what a royal court should be, the reference point against which other courts measured themselves, the example that showed how elaborate ceremony and careful social engineering could transform monarchy from a potentially unstable system dependent on personal relationships, into something more durable and institutional. Though even Versailles ultimately failed to preserve the monarchy when revolutionary pressures became too strong, when the whole system that it embodied was rejected by forces that its elaborate structures could not contain or co-opt, when the revolution swept away not just the Bourbon dynasty, but the entire world of privilege and hierarchy that the court represented, leaving Versailles as a monument to a vanished system, a museum of a way of life that had seemed eternal to those who lived it, but that proved to be as mortal as everything human, as subject to historical change as any institution, however magnificent and however carefully constructed. The hierarchy within a royal court was extraordinarily complex, with dozens or even hundreds of distinct positions and titles, each carrying specific duties and privileges, each occupying a precise place in the elaborate pecking order that governed all interactions and determined everything from where someone stood during ceremonies, to what they ate at meals, to how others addressed them, and whether they were expected to bow or receive bows from others. The complexity being deliberately cultivated because it served multiple purposes simultaneously, creating numerous positions that could be distributed as rewards for loyalty and service, establishing fine gradations of status that gave almost everyone someone to look down on, and someone to aspire to surpass, providing a framework for ordering interactions in environments where many people of different ranks came together regularly, demonstrating through its very elaboration the sophistication and refinement of court culture in ways that impressed outsiders and reinforced insiders' sense of belonging to an exclusive world governed by special knowledge and practices. At the top of this hierarchy, immediately below the royal family itself, which stood in a category apart from even the highest nobles, were the great officers of the crown, positions with titles like Lord Chamberlain or Lord High Steward, or Master of the Horse or Grand Master of the Household, roles that combined real administrative responsibilities, overseeing major departments of palace operations, with enormous prestige that derived partly from their functional importance, but mainly from their proximity to the monarch, that gave their holders significant influence over court life, and often over policy as well, since proximity to the monarch meant opportunities to offer advice during informal moments, to control access and information in ways that could shape decisions, to become confidants whose opinions were valued even on matters beyond their official responsibilities, these great officers typically being drawn from the highest nobility, families that had served the crown for generations, and whose loyalty was ensured through a combination of honour, hereditary service traditions, self-interest in maintaining the system that privileged them, and the considerable benefits that came from holding such positions, though of course loyalty was never absolute, and the history of courts includes countless instances of great officers who abused their positions for personal gain, who plotted against the monarchs they supposedly served, who used their access and influence to build personal power bases that sometimes rivaled royal authority, who demonstrated that proximity to power was not the same as loyalty to power, that service and self-interest were not always aligned, the relationship between monarch and great officers being one of necessary mutual dependence that could function smoothly when interests converged, but that could become a source of conflict and instability when they diverged, when officers used their positions to pursue personal agendas that conflicted with royal policy, when monarchs felt threatened by officers who had become too powerful or too independent, when the delicate balance of power that made the system work was disrupted by ambition or incompetence or simple personality conflicts, the potential for tension being built into a structure that concentrated power while also requiring delegation, that depended on cooperation from powerful people who had their own interests and ambitions, that balanced precariously between authoritarian centralization and aristocratic independence, working well when monarchs were strong and officers were loyal, but breaking down when circumstances changed, when weak kings faced strong nobles, or when systemic pressures overwhelmed the personal relationships on which the system ultimately rested, showing that courts were not simple hierarchies where commands flowed downward, unquestioned, but complex political environments where power was negotiated and contested constantly, where formal structures provided framework, but where actual functioning depended on personalities and relationships and constant manoeuvring. Below the great officers came layers upon layers of lesser positions, gentlemen of the bedchamber who attended the king in his private apartments, and whose intimacy with the royal person gave them influence that exceeded their formal rank, ladies-in-waiting who served the queen and other royal women, and who occupied a particular niche in court life, that combined service with social intimacy, who were usually drawn from noble families and whose positions were considered honourable rather than demeaning despite the service component, who formed a female court within the court with its own hierarchies and dynamics, that paralleled but differed from the male-dominated official structures, pages and squires who performed various service functions while being trained in courtly behaviour, and who often came from noble families seeking to place their sons where they could learn court ways and make useful connections, courtiers who held positions that were sometimes largely ceremonial, involving duties that were light or even non-existent but that carried prestige and access that made them valuable, despite the limited actual work involved. The elaboration of titles and positions serving partly practical purposes, ensuring that all necessary functions were performed by someone whose duty it was to perform them, but also serving symbolic purposes that were at least as important as the practical ones. The multiplication of positions creating opportunities to reward loyalty and service without having to grant expensive pensions or land grants, to distribute favour among various noble families, ensuring that more families had connections to court and thus stakes in maintaining the system, to maintain a large and impressive court that demonstrated royal magnificence through sheer numbers that attracted nobles who might otherwise have remained in their provincial estates, the size and splendour of a court being both cause and effect of royal power, powerful monarchs maintaining large courts as demonstrations of their wealth and importance, and to attract and support large numbers of nobles, while the very existence of a large court enhanced royal power by concentrating nobility at the capital, where they could be monitored and controlled, where their energies were directed toward competing for royal favour rather than building independent power, where their children could be raised at court, absorbing court culture and forming relationships that bound them more closely to the monarchy than to their local regions, creating self-reinforcing cycles where impressive courts attracted nobles whose presence made courts more impressive, where power concentrated at the centre drew more nobles to that centre, which further concentrated power there, where the court became the unavoidable centre of political, social and cultural life for the entire kingdom, eclipsing provincial centres and local power structures, making royal favour more valuable than local influence, transforming nobles from independent territorial lords into courtiers who depended on royal goodwill, the transformation being accomplished gradually over generations through mechanisms that seemed social and cultural, but that had profound political effects, changing the nature of aristocratic power and the relationship between monarch and nobility in ways that strengthened monarchy while weakening nobility's capacity for independent action. The court being the instrument through which absolute monarchy was constructed, not through conquest, but through social engineering, through the creation of culture and customs that embedded royal supremacy in daily practice. The daily schedule of a royal court was highly structured, organised around the movements and activities of the monarch whose person was the centre around which everything else revolved, the sun around which courtiers orbited like planets, the entire court adjusting its rhythms to royal routines that were themselves dictated partly by personal preference, since monarchs were not entirely free to organise their days as they pleased, partly by custom and tradition that specified appropriate times for various activities, and that monarchs violated at peril of seeming eccentric or incompetent, partly by the demands of governance and ceremony that filled royal days with obligations both formal and informal, both public and private, though the line between public and private was far less clear than modern people would expect, with even the most intimate moments of royal life becoming ceremonial occasions attended by courtiers whose presence transformed personal activities into political theatre, whose observation and participation converted biological necessities and daily routines into performances that had audiences and significance beyond their practical purposes, the monarch never truly being alone or off duty, always performing the role of king or queen, even in moments that seem private to modern sensibilities, but that were thoroughly public in court contexts where hundreds of people lived in close proximity, and where royal person was both a human individual with bodily needs and daily rhythms, and a symbolic figure whose every action carried potential meaning, whose choices and behaviours were scrutinised for signals about favour and policy, who could never entirely separate personal preference from political consequence, since everything a monarch did was observed and interpreted by courtiers seeking clues about status, and seeking opportunities to advance their interests, making royal life simultaneously powerful and constrained, commanding yet restricted, where monarchs could generally get what they wanted but could never entirely escape the obligations and performances that their positions required, where being king meant living according to scripts and rituals that limited spontaneity and demanded constant attention to appearance and protocol, where even genuine emotions had to be carefully managed and expressed appropriately, where the burden of constant performance must have been psychologically taxing, even for those who were trained from birth to bear it, who never knew anything different but who still must have felt the weight of always being watched, always being central, always bearing the responsibility of embodying monarchy adequately, of living up to expectations, of maintaining dignity and presence appropriate to exalted status, of never showing weakness or inappropriate emotion, or any crack in the perfect facade that monarchy required. The personal cost of being royal being considerable even for those who enjoyed enormous privilege and power, the constraints of the role being as real as its benefits, though of course the constraints on kings were trivial compared to those on most people in their societies, the gilded cage still being incomparably more comfortable than the situations of ordinary subjects. The point being not to elicit sympathy for monarchs, but to understand that power operated within structures that shaped and limited even those who seemed most free, that the system constrained everyone, including those at the top, though obviously in very different ways and to vastly different degrees. The day typically began with the lever or rising ceremony, an elaborate ritual that varied in details between different courts, and that evolved over time, but that generally involved a carefully choreographed progression of attendants who helped the monarch dress, each step in the dressing process involving specific people, according to their rank and the privileges associated with their positions, each article of clothing being presented by a designated person who had the honour of performing that particular service, with the privilege of handing the king his shirt, or buckling the queen's shoes, or holding the royal nightgown being jealously guarded, honours that might seem absurd to modern sensibilities, but that carried real significance in a world where proximity to royal person translated directly into political influence and social prestige, where the ability to claim that one dressed the king each morning was worth fighting for because it demonstrated favour, because it provided daily access that others lacked, because it created opportunities for private conversation during the intimate moments of dressing when the king might be more relaxed and approachable than during formal audiences, when a word skillfully dropped might influence a decision or advance an interest, when observing the king's mood and health provided information that could be valuable politically or financially, the morning lever becoming not just a dressing ceremony, but a political event, a daily occasion when the pecking order was visible and reinforced through the staging of who entered when and who performed which services, when those who had right of entry could demonstrate their status to others through their presence and their role in the ceremony, could position themselves for favour through attentiveness and discretion, could engage in the subtle competition for royal attention that characterised court life, while those excluded from the lever's inner sanctum had to content themselves with whatever access they could gain in the more public portions of the royal day, their exclusion being marked and noted, their distance from favour being visible to everyone, their position in the hierarchy being confirmed daily through their absence from this intimate ceremony, the lever thus serving multiple functions simultaneously, practically getting the king dressed for the day, but also politically reinforcing hierarchies and providing access and demonstrating favour and gathering information and maintaining relationships and performing the daily ritual that marked the beginning of the court's day, that signalled to everyone that the king was awake and the business of court could commence. That started the elaborate clock that was the court's daily schedule, the personal act of rising and dressing being transformed into a state ceremony that involved dozens of people, and that exemplified how even the most mundane aspects of royal life were embedded in elaborate social structures that gave them meanings far beyond their practical purposes, showing how completely monarchy was performed rather than simply being, how the role of king required constant theatrical presentation, how maintaining royal mystique demanded that every act be staged and controlled and made meaningful through ceremony. Following the lever came breakfast or the morning meal, though this varied considerably by period and location and personal preference, some monarchs eating very little in the morning while others had substantial meals, the meal itself being an occasion for a smaller group of privileged courtiers who had breakfast access, a time when conversation might range across various topics, political and social and personal, when the monarch could consult with advisers informally, or simply enjoy company in an atmosphere that was slightly more relaxed than most court occasions, though still governed by protocol and propriety, when the business of the day ahead might be previewed and discussed informally without the formality of council meetings, when the king's thoughts and inclinations might become visible through casual remarks that attentive courtiers would note and interpret and perhaps act upon. These meals being working sessions as much as social occasions, opportunities to raise issues indirectly, or sound out opinions informally, or simply maintain the relationships that oiled the machinery of court politics, where what was discussed was often less important than who was present, who had been invited into this relatively intimate setting, who was positioned to have the king's ear during these unguarded moments, when formal ceremony was relaxed slightly, though never entirely abandoned, even breakfast among intimates being governed by rules about precedence and deference that never completely disappeared at court, where hierarchy was so deeply ingrained that it shaped even casual interactions, where one could never truly forget who was king and who was subject, where roles were always present even in moments that seemed relaxed, where the performance of monarchy was slightly less intense but never entirely absent. The king never being simply a person having breakfast with friends, but always being king even in this more intimate setting. The other diners being selected not randomly, but according to favour and political calculus, their presence at the king's breakfast table being itself a message about their standing, about royal preferences, about the current state of court factions and alliances, breakfast invitations being sought after and carefully noted, absences being interpreted, the composition of the breakfast party being something that courtiers monitored and that could shift as favour shifted or as political circumstances changed, making even this seemingly casual meal another site of political theatre and social competition, another space where court dynamics played out, another occasion when proximity to the king had to be negotiated and achieved and maintained through constant attention and skillful manoeuvring. The middle portion of the day was typically devoted to governance and administration, the actual work of ruling that was the monarch's primary responsibility, and that could not be entirely delegated however elaborate the administrative apparatus became, with the monarch receiving ministers and officials who reported on various matters requiring royal attention or decision, attending council meetings where policy was discussed and debated though final decisions remained with the king, who listened to advice but was not bound by it, reviewing documents and making decisions about appointments and policies, and military matters and diplomatic questions, granting audiences to petitioners and ambassadors who sought royal favour or intervention, or who brought messages from foreign courts, performing the actual work of ruling that was less glamorous than ceremonies but more consequential, that required intelligence and attention and judgment, that separated competent rulers from incompetent ones, since the elaborate court system could function reasonably well on autopilot for administrative matters, but major decisions genuinely required royal input, required choices that only the monarch could make, or that derived their authority from royal approval, the governance functions being conducted with ceremony and spectacle, even though they were fundamentally administrative activities, with audiences granted in throne rooms where the monarch sat elevated above others, on a literal throne that visually reinforced the metaphorical throne that represented royal authority, where the physical staging emphasized the gap between ruler and ruled, where even the architecture communicated power relationships with the king occupying the highest position, looking down on subjects who approached from below, who had to request permission to advance closer, who bowed or knelt depending on protocol and the nature of their business, where the business of government was conducted in ways that reinforced royal authority and mystique, rather than diminishing it through the revelation that governance was often mundane and technical, rather than heroic and dramatic, that transformed routine decisions into occasions for demonstrating majesty and receiving deference, the line between governing and performing being blurry at best, with monarchs understanding that effective rule required not just wise decisions, but impressive presentation, that power had to be seen and felt, not just exercised behind closed doors, that abstract authority needed to be made concrete through ritual and display, through the elaborate theatre that characterised court life, and that served purposes beyond mere vanity or entertainment, purposes that were fundamentally political, that made the system work by creating an aura of inevitability and rightness around royal authority, by making that authority seem natural and proper, and even divinely ordained through the constant repetition of ceremonies that positioned the monarch above ordinary humans in ways that suggested supernatural sanction, or at least extraordinary virtue and capability, that presented royal power as sacred and inviolable, rather than as contingent political arrangement that rested ultimately on force and consent, that made resistance or even questioning seem not just illegal, but almost sacrilegious, a violation of natural order as well as positive law, a transgression against cosmic hierarchy as well as earthly authority, the ceremonial and theological dimensions of monarchy being as important as its administrative and military dimensions, perhaps more important since they operated on consciousnesses and shaped beliefs in ways that made people accept royal authority not just from fear of punishment, but from genuine conviction that it was right and proper and commanded by God. The ideological construction of monarchy being the invisible foundation that made the visible apparatus of power effective, that turned raw coercion into legitimate authority, that made millions of people accept the rule of single individuals who differed from ordinary people, not in any objective way but in accidents of birth, the elaborate theatre of court life being the mechanism through which this transformation was accomplished, through which contingent power was presented as necessary authority, through which political arrangements were naturalised and made to seem inevitable, through which history and human choice were erased and replaced by stories of divine selection and natural hierarchy, the court being essentially a machine for manufacturing consent and legitimacy, for creating the psychological and social conditions under which monarchy could function smoothly without constant resort to violence, where subjects obeyed not from fear alone but from belief, from acceptance of monarchy as proper and right, from inability to imagine alternatives because the entire culture reinforced monarchical principles, because every ceremony and ritual and daily routine embedded those principles deeper into collective consciousness, because growing up in a world organised entirely around monarchy made it seem like the only possible way to organise society, the court's greatest achievement being not its administrative efficiency or its cultural productions, but its success in making monarchy seem inevitable. Meals were major events in court life, occasions that combined necessity with ceremony, that served both practical and symbolic purposes, particularly dinner, which was the main meal of the day, and which often became elaborate public spectacles, especially at larger courts, where hundreds of people might be fed simultaneously. The logistics of producing and serving so many meals requiring substantial staff and careful organisation that modern people would struggle to comprehend given how accustomed we are to industrial food production and distribution, with kitchens that were large operations employing dozens of cooks and servants and specialists who did nothing but prepare particular types of dishes, pastry experts and sauce makers and roasters and carvers and preservers, each person having specific skills and responsibilities, with complex supply chains that brought food from royal estates scattered across the kingdom and from markets and vendors who competed for the privilege of supplying the court, with storage facilities that held the vast quantities of provisions needed to feed a court that consumed enormous amounts daily, with procedures for ensuring food safety and quality, since the threat of poisoning was ever present and taken very seriously, not from paranoia, but from realistic assessment of dangers that monarchs actually faced. Attempts on royal lives through poison being common enough throughout European history that careful precautions were justified and necessary, meals being both sustenance and potential danger, requiring constant vigilance and elaborate precautions that included official tasters who sampled dishes before they reached the royal table, risking their own lives to ensure royal safety, with elaborate procedures for tracking who had access to food during preparation and service, ensuring that the chain of custody was documented and controlled, with careful attention to seals and security that made royal dining a complicated business far beyond the simple act of eating, the precautions themselves becoming part of court ceremony, the tasting rituals being performed publicly to demonstrate that food was safe, to reassure the king, and to impress observers with the seriousness and completeness of royal security arrangements, the practical necessity of avoiding poison being transformed into ceremonial performance that enhanced rather than diminished royal mystique by emphasizing how precious and how endangered royal life was, how many people worked to preserve it, how elaborate the arrangements needed to be to protect the sacred person of the king from those who would harm him. The meals themselves were served with great ceremony, processions of servants carrying dishes from kitchens through corridors and rooms to dining halls, the food travelling distances and requiring coordination that made serving hot meals a genuine challenge, courses arriving in carefully orchestrated sequence, each course being presented first to the monarch and then distributed to others according to rank and privilege, the best dishes and the largest portions going to those of higher status. The quality and quantity of food served to each person, communicating their position in the hierarchy as clearly as any title or official rank. The entire meal being a performance of social order, a daily reminder of everyone's place, with the monarch's table positioned prominently, usually elevated on a dais, so that everyone else literally looked up to see the royal family eating, looked up both literally and metaphorically. The physical staging reinforcing the social and political realities that placed the monarch above everyone else, with specific rules about who could sit and who had to stand during royal meals, about who could eat in the royal presence and who had to serve and then eat elsewhere after royal dining was complete, about what could be said and how one should behave while eating, about the proper ways to request items or to compliment the meal, or to navigate all the small social interactions that occurred during dining. The meal being not a relaxed social occasion where people simply enjoyed food and conversation, but another court ceremony where every detail carried meaning, where behaviour was scrutinised by dozens of eyes watching for breaches of etiquette, or signs of rising or falling favour, where the wrong fork or an awkward reach or a spilled drop of wine could become embarrassing incidents that would be discussed and remembered, where performing perfectly required constant attention and practice, where newcomers struggled until they learned the complex unwritten rules that governed every aspect of court dining, where foreign ambassadors sometimes committed faux pas that became diplomatic incidents, or at least sources of amusement and gossip. The elaborate rules that governed meals, serving multiple purposes including practical organisation of service, but primarily serving to distinguish insiders from outsiders through knowledge of arbitrary complex protocols that could only be learned through long exposure to court life, marking those who belonged from those who did not, making the court an exclusive world with its own practices and standards that newcomers found difficult to master, however high their rank or intelligence, the complexity being deliberately maintained and even cultivated because it served these gatekeeping functions, because it made court society distinctive and exclusive, because it created barriers that protected existing elites from newcomers who might otherwise challenge their positions, the elaborate dining rituals being simultaneously practical means of organising service and symbolic performances of hierarchy and cultural barriers that marked boundaries and maintained distinctiveness, multiple functions being served simultaneously by practices that seemed merely to be about eating, but that were actually about much more, about power and prestige and belonging and exclusion, about performing social identity and demonstrating cultivation, about marking every person's precise position in the elaborate structure that organised court society into finely gradated layers of precedence and privilege. Afternoons at court brought different activities depending on the season and the weather, and the monarch's interests and inclinations, hunting being particularly popular among kings who enjoyed the sport and who used hunting expeditions as occasions for exercise and display of skill and courage, for demonstrating martial prowess in relatively safe contexts where wild animals replaced human enemies, for male bonding with favoured nobles in settings that were less formal than palace ceremonies, for informal conversations away from the rigid atmosphere of the court, where gossip and news could be exchanged more freely, where relationships could be built and maintained through shared experiences and activities, though hunting expeditions were themselves elaborate affairs requiring extensive preparation and support, staffed despite their apparent informality compared to palace life, with huntsmen who knew the terrain and the habits of game animals, with stable hands who prepared horses and maintained equipment, with beaters who drove game toward hunters, with dog handlers who managed the packs of hounds that were essential to many types of hunting, and all the logistics needed to move the court temporarily into the countryside, with pavilions erected to provide shelter and dining facilities, with refreshments and entertainment brought along to maintain appropriate comfort and dignity, even while pursuing game through forests and across fields, the hunt being another ceremony as much as a sport, another opportunity for performance and display despite its veneer of informal recreation, another way that monarchs demonstrated prowess and engaged with nobles in activities that built relationships and reinforced loyalty through shared pleasures that created memories and stories that would be retold, and that bound participants together through common experiences that made the king seem not just a distant figure of authority, sitting on a throne passing judgment, but also a leader and companion who shared in masculine pursuits, someone whose person inspired loyalty not just from duty or interest, but from genuine affection or admiration, developed through personal interaction in contexts that seemed to reveal character more authentically than formal ceremonies could, though of course even hunting was performance to some degree, even the apparent informality being carefully managed, even the spontaneous moments being staged to some extent, the blurring of authentic and performative being characteristic of court life, where everything was both genuine and theatrical, where distinguishing between real relationships and strategic alliances was often impossible because the two were thoroughly intertwined, where personal and political could not be separated because in a system based on personal rule and direct relationships between monarch and nobles, every personal interaction had potential political dimensions, and every political relationship was conducted through the language and forms of personal connection. For those who did not hunt or on days when hunting was not scheduled, afternoons might be filled with other activities, walks in palace gardens which were themselves elaborate constructions designed to impress and delight, with carefully planned layouts and ornamental plantings and water features and statuary, gardens being extensions of the palace, where the control and ordering of nature demonstrated power and taste, just as the control and ordering of people demonstrated political authority, visits to workshops and studios where artists and craftsmen worked on projects commissioned by the court, the monarch's patronage of arts and crafts being both culturally significant, producing works that enriched European civilization, and politically significant demonstrating wealth and sophistication that enhanced royal prestige, inspection of building projects since major courts were usually engaged in construction or renovation, palaces being never fully complete, but always being expanded and improved and adapted to changing needs and tastes, the constant building activity being both practical response to real needs for more space and symbolic demonstration of power and permanence, visits to military facilities and reviews of troops since security was constant concern and since displaying military strength was important for maintaining authority and deterring challenges, afternoons providing time for the diverse activities that courts engaged in beyond the core ceremonial and administrative functions, for the cultural and military and recreational aspects that made courts, centres of civilization in the broader sense, places where art was created and military force was organised, and scientific knowledge was pursued and cultural standards were set, courts being multifunctional institutions that combined roles that modern societies distribute across many separate institutions, government and household, and military headquarters and cultural centre, and entertainment venue all rolled together in single establishment under single authority, the concentration reflecting the personalised nature of monarchy, where all functions ultimately related back to the person of the monarch and were organised around supporting and projecting royal power, everything existing to serve the king and to make the kingdom function under royal direction, the medieval and early modern state being inseparable from the royal household, public and private being merged in ways that seem strange to modern observers, accustomed to clear separations between government and personal life. But that made perfect sense in systems based on personal authority, where the king's household literally was the government, where officers of the household were also officers of state, where serving the king personally and serving the kingdom were not distinguished, because the kingdom was conceived as belonging to the king who ruled it as property and inheritance rather than as trust, or as representative of popular sovereignty, the proprietary nature of monarchy making the royal court the obvious centre of everything, the place where the king was being the place where power resided and where anyone seeking to influence events needed to be, making court the inescapable centre of political and social life for the nobility and for ambitious people generally. So evenings brought different entertainments and activities, concerts and theatrical performances put on by professional entertainers or by courtiers themselves who were expected to possess various accomplishments including musical abilities, gambling and card games that could involve significant sums of money and that could be ruinous for those who played recklessly or simply had bad luck, balls and dancing that provided opportunities for social mixing and for displaying grace and skill, dancing being serious business at court where being able to perform the latest dances perfectly was important social skill, conversations and literary gatherings where wit and erudition could be displayed, salons organised by influential women where intellectual and cultural topics were discussed, flirtation and romantic intrigue since courts brought together young people in environments where social interaction was constant, and where marriages were important, political and economic transactions that families pursued strategically, evening hours providing time for the social and cultural activities that made court attractive especially to younger courtiers who might find ceremonies and formalities tedious, but who enjoyed the entertainments and social opportunities that court life offered. The evening gathering being occasions for building alliances and conducting politics informally, for arranging marriages and making deals, for assessing character and demonstrating qualities that might advance interests, for all the social navigation that was essential to success at court, where relationships mattered enormously, and where being well connected and well liked could matter as much as formal position or official responsibilities, where a well-placed word during a card game might be more effective than a formal petition in advancing an interest or securing a favour, where charm and conversation skills were political assets as valuable as administrative competence, where the ability to entertain and be entertaining translated into influence and access, because monarchs and powerful courtiers naturally favoured those whose company they enjoyed, making what seemed like mere leisure actually another form of work for ambitious courtiers, another arena where they competed and manoeuvred for advantage, where success or failure could affect careers and fortunes in ways that were no less real for being indirect, where seemingly trivial matters like whether one was invited to the Queen's music evening or seated near the King during a theatrical performance carried real significance, because they marked changes in status that everyone noticed, and that could signal rising or falling favour with consequences that extended beyond the immediate social situation. Courts being places where the small details of social life were scrutinised obsessively, where everyone was constantly watching everyone else looking for signs of changing dynamics, constantly calculating relative positions and noting shifts in the complex web of relationships and alliances that constituted court society, constantly aware that nothing was truly private or insignificant, that every interaction might be observed and might affect reputation and standing in ways that could have practical consequences for wealth and position and influence, and access to the resources and opportunities that the court controlled, and that could only be obtained through favour and connection. The evening routine concluded with the coucher or retiring ceremony, the mirror image of the morning lever, another elaborate ritual where the monarch was undressed and prepared for bed, with the same careful attention to protocol and precedence that characterised the morning ceremony, the same competition for access and privilege among courtiers who sought the honour of assisting with the royal undressing, the same transformation of private acts into public performance, the day ending as it had begun with ritual and hierarchy, with the reinforcement of the structures that defined court life, with the monarch never truly being alone or private even in the most intimate moments of preparing for sleep, always attended by servants and courtiers, always the centre of attention and ceremony, always performing the role of monarch even when preparing for rest. The coucher providing a final opportunity for a small group of privileged courtiers to have access to the royal presence, to observe and be seen observing, to end the day in proximity to power, a privilege that many would have envied, that marked those who participated as among the inner circle of trusted intimates, as people of importance and favour, whose relationship with the monarch was close enough to extend into these late evening hours, when the court's public functions had ended and only the most trusted and favoured remained in the royal presence. These retiring ceremonies being in some ways even more significant than the morning rituals, because evening access suggested genuine intimacy and real favour rather than just formal protocol, suggested that the monarch actually wanted the company of those present, rather than merely accepting their obligatory attendance as part of morning routine, though of course distinguishing between genuine affection and strategic relationship building was usually impossible in court contexts, where both monarch and courtiers were skilled at performance, at showing what was advantageous to show regardless of actual feelings, at maintaining useful relationships regardless of personal preferences, everyone understanding that successful court life required separating personal feelings from strategic behaviour, required cultivating relationships with people one might not particularly like if those relationships served interests, required treating people warmly, who might be rivals or enemies, in ways that maintained surface civility and functionality while concealing underlying tensions, the court being fundamentally a place where authentic emotion had to be carefully managed and controlled, where showing true feelings could be dangerous, where maintaining appropriate mask at all times was essential to protecting interests and maintaining position, where exhaustion from constant performance must have been a significant challenge, even for those most skilled at social navigation, where the psychological costs of never being able to relax completely, never being entirely off duty, never being free from observation and judgment, must have taken toll over time, though such costs were rarely discussed or acknowledged, being understood as simply part of the price of participating in court life, of pursuing the rewards and opportunities that court offered to those who mastered its demands and succeeded in its competitive environment. The staff who made court life possible remained largely invisible in historical accounts that focused on monarchs and nobles and major political events, but these workers were absolutely essential to everything that happened at court. The machinery that made the visible spectacle function, the foundation that supported the elaborate superstructure of ceremony and governance, without whom the entire enterprise would have collapsed immediately into chaos, though their work was taken entirely for granted by those they served, and was rarely acknowledged or appreciated except when it failed to meet expectations. When meals were late, or rooms were dirty, or ceremonies were disrupted by logistical failures that brought the usually invisible support operations briefly into view before disappearing again once problems were fixed, only the failures being noticed, while successful execution of countless complex tasks went unremarked and unappreciated. The staff suffering the common fate of all service workers whose best work is invisible because it allows everything to function smoothly as if by magic without requiring attention or thought from those served, who are noticed only when something goes wrong, who perform essential functions while receiving minimal recognition and often inadequate compensation. Though working at royal courts did provide some benefits, including steady employment, which was valuable in economies where work could be irregular and uncertain, housing and food, which were significant advantages, and the prestige of serving the monarch, which might seem like poor compensation for hard work, but which actually mattered in status-conscious societies, where working for prestigious employer conferred reflected glory on servants who could claim association with royalty even if their actual positions were humble, advantages that made court positions genuinely desirable, despite demanding work and often difficult conditions, with positions being sought after by many applicants, and often being passed down through families creating dynasties of court servants who spent generations in royal service, fathers training sons and mothers training daughters in the specific skills and knowledge required for particular positions, accumulating expertise and institutional knowledge that made them valuable, even if individually replaceable. Their continuity across changes in monarchs and ministers, providing stability and ensuring that procedures and traditions were maintained even when leadership changed, these staff members being in important ways the real keepers of court traditions, the people who actually knew how things were supposed to be done because they had been doing them for decades, or had learned from parents and grandparents who had done them before, whose knowledge and experience made them quietly powerful despite their formally subordinate positions, giving them influence that exceeded their official status, because their expertise was indispensable, because courtiers and even royal family members had to rely on them to navigate the complex procedures and protocols that governed court life, and that were too numerous and detailed for anyone to remember completely, without help from those who managed them daily, creating a kind of informal power that ran counter to the official hierarchy, servants who theoretically had no status actually possessing significant practical influence because they controlled information and access, because they knew how things worked and could make things happen or prevent things from happening through their cooperation or obstruction, because they were essential to the functioning of a system that could not operate without them, regardless of how little formal recognition their contributions received. The power of the indispensable being real even when unacknowledged, the dependence of the mighty on the humble being genuine even when denied or ignored. The kitchens employed dozens or even hundreds of people in the largest courts, not just cooks who actually prepared dishes, but also highly specialised workers who did nothing but prepare particular types of foods, pastry specialists whose entire careers revolved around creating elaborate desserts and bread, sauce makers who developed complex flavour combinations and who guarded their recipes carefully, roasters who managed the enormous fireplaces and ovens and spits where meats and other foods were cooked, preservers who extended the life of perishable foods through salting and smoking and other techniques that allowed courts to maintain food supplies across seasons, workers who cleaned and maintained the elaborate equipment that large-scale cooking required, servants who carried water for cooking and cleaning since kitchens required enormous quantities of water that had to be hauled from wells or rivers, workers who brought wood and coal for the fires that burned continuously in kitchen hearths, servants who carried ingredients from storage areas to workstations, and who moved prepared dishes from kitchens to dining areas, children who performed simple tasks like turning spits or running errands or cleaning up. A complex operation that functioned like a small factory, organised into departments with specialised workers performing specific tasks, producing hundreds or thousands of meals daily, operating on schedules that required starting work in the early morning hours, well before dawn, to have meals ready at the required times, working in hot, smoky, crowded conditions that were probably unpleasant even by the standards of the time, when most people lived and worked in conditions that modern people would find intolerable. The kitchen staff labouring out of sight of the diners they served in spaces that were functional rather than elegant, their work being invisible to those who consumed its products, except for the results, the dishes that arrived in the dining rooms being the only aspect that mattered to diners who rarely if ever thought about the enormous effort required to produce those meals, the social distance between kitchen staff and court nobility being so vast that they inhabited almost different worlds despite sharing the same palace complex, the nobility having no more awareness of how their meals were prepared than modern restaurant diners typically have of restaurant kitchens, the work being completely hidden and taken for granted, relegated to servants who were not considered worth thinking about, whose lives and labour were simply assumed to be available to serve noble needs without anyone questioning whether this arrangement was just, or considering what it cost those who performed the work, the inequality of the system being so normalised and so embedded in the basic structures of society that even relatively kind and thoughtful nobles probably gave little consideration to the people who made their comfortable lives possible, accepting service as their natural due, as the proper order of things, as simply how the world worked and had always worked, without recognising or caring about the human cost of maintaining that world, about the long hours of hard physical labour in difficult conditions, about the minimal rewards relative to the value of the work performed, about how the lives of these workers were entirely subordinated to serving others with little time or energy, remaining for their own interests and families and lives, their existence being instrumental rather than valued for itself, mattering only insofar as it contributed to noble comfort and magnificence. The fundamental inequality and exploitation that underpinned the entire system being hidden by social structures that presented these arrangements as natural rather than constructed, as inevitable rather than chosen, as reflecting merit and divine will rather than historical accidents of birth, and the systematic maintenance of privilege across generations through legal and social mechanisms that prevented mobility and change. The daily functioning of a great royal court represented an extraordinary feat of organisation and coordination, bringing together thousands of people, performing hundreds of different functions in ways that were synchronised and integrated enough to produce the appearance of effortless magnificence that was the court's ultimate product, the visible result of all the invisible labour, the spectacle that demonstrated royal power and that supported the legitimacy and authority that effective monarchy required. The complexity of the operation would challenge modern organisations with sophisticated management techniques and communication technologies, yet courts managed to function reasonably well using organisational methods that seem primitive by contemporary standards, relying on tradition and established routine, on hierarchies that specified clear chains of command and responsibility, on specialists who performed particular functions and who knew their roles thoroughly through long practice, on informal networks and personal relationships that filled gaps in formal structures, on the motivation that came from pride in service to prestigious institution and from fear of punishment for failures, creating systems that were robust enough to survive most challenges while being flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, courts demonstrating that effective organisation does not necessarily require modern bureaucratic rationalisation, that traditional methods based on personal relationships and hierarchical authority and accumulated expertise could accomplish complex tasks, though obviously not with the efficiency or predictability that modern management achieves, but adequately for the purposes they served, producing results that contemporaries found impressive, even if modern observers might note the enormous waste and inefficiency that characterised these operations where redundancy was built in through multiple people performing overlapping functions, where resources were consumed lavishly without much concern for economy, where display was valued more than the efficiency, and where appearing magnificent mattered more than being efficient, the priorities being different from modern organisational priorities but being rational within the context of systems where legitimacy depended on performance, and where power required demonstration, where seeming powerful was as important as being powerful, and where resources existed primarily to be displayed rather than to be preserved or invested, the economic logic of courts being different from modern economic logic in ways that reflected different values and different purposes, courts existing not to maximise efficiency or profit but to demonstrate power and to organise political relationships, to serve political and social rather than economic purposes, even though they consumed enormous economic resources, the economic function being subordinate to and instrumental for political and social functions that were the court's real purpose and reason for existence. The story of how European royal courts actually functioned reveals much about the nature of pre-modern political systems and about the ways that power operated in personal monarchies, where abstract institutions mattered less than direct relationships between individuals, where bureaucratic rules were less important than personal favour and informal networks, where everything ultimately depended on the monarch's will and character, and on the complex web of relationships and obligations that bound monarch and nobles in mutual dependencies, that structured political life and organised the competition for resources and opportunities that drove much of court behaviour. Understanding courts means understanding a form of power that was both absolutely centralised in theory, with the monarch supposedly possessing unlimited authority, and highly diffused in practice, with power being exercised through networks of personal relationships that limited even absolute monarchs, that made even the strongest kings dependent on cooperation from nobles and officials who had their own interests and agendas, the reality of power being far more complex and negotiated than the formal theories of absolutism suggested, courts being the arenas where this negotiation happened constantly through the daily interactions and ceremonies and social manoeuvrings that constituted court life, where power was performed and displayed but also contested and challenged in subtle ways that formal accounts often missed, where the distance between official ideology and practical reality was considerable, even though both were real and both mattered, the performance of absolute power being important even when the reality fell short of the performance. The ceremonies and rituals that presented monarchs as all-powerful serving purposes, even when everyone involved understood that actual power was more limited and more dependent on consent and cooperation than the ceremonies acknowledged, the gap between representation and reality being knowable to insiders while being concealed from outsiders, everyone at court understanding that the magnificent spectacle was partly performance while also being real in its effects, that the ceremonies both reflected and created power relationships, that playing the game according to established rules was necessary, even for those who understood that the rules were artificial and that the game was partially theatre, the sophisticated understanding that courtiers developed about the constructed nature of court life and monarchical authority coexisting with genuine belief in royal legitimacy and with real deference to royal power, the complexity being too great for simple explanations, the reality being that multiple things were true simultaneously, that power was both performance and reality, that hierarchy was both artificial and genuine, that relationships were both strategic and authentic, that the court was both elaborate theatre and real political arena, that understanding how courts functioned requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously and recognising that the system worked at multiple levels and served multiple purposes all at once, that reducing courts to simple formulas misses the richness and complexity that made them so fascinating and so effective as instruments of governance and as centres of culture and civilization for the centuries when they dominated European political and social life.